Welcome to Ministry to Children in Crisis, Austin Graduate School of Theology online course, Ministry 4353. It has been said by Hubert H. Humphrey that the moral test of a society is how it treats those at the dawn of life, the children, and those at the shadows of life, the sick and needy, and those in the twilight of life, the elderly and the dying. We will be looking at two aspects of this statement, and that is with those at the dawn of life, the children who are also sick and needy, are experiencing grief and loss. So it's a very timely and very important course, and I look forward to studying with you. A list of course objectives, as we see here, we'll be studying throughout this time together. Number one, to examine biblical and theological foundations concerning children. Number two, to outline Jesus' mandate of ministry to children as citizens of the kingdom of God, especially in the synoptics. Both Matthew, Mark, and Luke all include Jesus' encounter with the parents bringing their children to be blessed by Jesus, and the apostles' rebuke of those parents, and then Jesus in turn rebukes the disciples and says, "Let the little children come to me." So this, I believe, speaks of a mandate to us as citizens of the kingdom. Number three, to discuss childhood trauma and its effect on brain development. Number four, to examine and describe the psychological and developmental concerns as relating to the grieving process of the child. Not only do people grieve differently because we're all different people, but also children grieve differently in different stages of their own development across the spectrum, from birth to adolescence. Adolescents normally grieve similarly, older adolescents similarly to that of adults. Number five, to understand the meaning of disenfranchised grief as it relates to giving care to children. We'll define disenfranchised grief. We'll introduce it today, and then we'll continue in a further session. In a later session, we will discuss disenfranchised grief as defined by Dr. Kenneth Doka and others. Number six, to analyze appropriate methods of intervention for ministry to children in crisis. We want to provide a safe space for the Spirit to work in the lives of children, and we'll look at that as well. So these are the course objectives that we'll look at throughout our 8 weeks together. The learning goals for this particular module of the introduction is to define the course objectives, which we have just done, to understand the requirements of Austin Graduate School of Theology Online Essentials. So I want to direct your attention to that activity, that you'll read that and then sign off on it, that you have completed that. And then through a grief and loss inventory, we will ask you to recall your own childhood experience of grief and loss, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. My personal story is that of a little child, I guess was about 6 years old, which plays a part in my own decision to research and to do more work with children in grief, was that of my grandfather. When I was about 6 years old, he was killed in a farming accident. The story is that my grandmother had left his dinner on the stove, and on those days they had a pilot and a gas stove, a pilot light in the middle of the stove, or the burners on top of the stove. She would leave the covered dish on top of the stove to keep it warm. When she returned home, she noticed that he was in the exact same position as when she left over an hour prior to that. My uncle went out and found him underneath a farm implement. He had been crushed. But what happened after that was that my cousins that were close to my age and myself were kind of shuffled off to a distant relative's home during the funeral. We weren't told really what was going on. We were just told that he was killed. And it always puzzled me. I imagined him suffering. I imagined all sorts of things. But we weren't allowed to go to a visitation. We weren't allowed to go see our grandfather in the casket. We were not allowed to go to the funeral. And so that's part of my personal story as to the questions that I believe children have as they're experiencing or having encounters such as this. What do we as adults teach them? What do we model for them? How can we assist them in better ways to deal with and to handle and cope with grief and other trauma events of their lives? So why is this study? It's my belief that we must come to understand our personal story if we are to give counsel to others, especially to children who grieve. The care we give to others as adults will be insufficient if we don't deal with our own stuff, our own grief, and do our own work. There will be gaps in our care otherwise. So what do we need as a church, as caregivers? As I said in the introduction, I believe as a church we need to provide a safe space for the Spirit to work in the lives of children who grieve, who have trauma, who have crises in their lives. We can be that safe space to provide a safe space with us as we build rapport, and also to provide opportunities for them to be able to work through their experiences and their grief and trauma. As we consider the early life of North American culture, children in early life were considered as being vital contributors of the household, working right alongside their parents and extended family members who lived together on the farm. Until the mid-20th century, however, the United States was primarily an agrarian society with several generations living either under the same roof or on the same property in close proximity to grandparents and even great-grandparents. Living and working on the farm, you see, children grew up experiencing death all around them, not only of relatives who would be laid out on a kitchen table perhaps for a wake, and family and friends would come over and view the body. And they would know this person is really dead. But it also included that of farm animals, as they would see cattle or stillbirths or other animals that would die on the farm, and they would bury those animals or burn them. So children grew up experiencing death all around them. It was just a part of life, you see, a part of life cycle. Kenneth Doka writes that until the 20th century, most young children witnessed death, dying, grieving, mourning, funerals within their own homes. So during the 20th century, then life in the United States was increasingly industrialized as they began to move away from an agrarian society. And with this change also came changes within the family. Families became more mobile. Family members often lived at great distances from one another. New services were utilized, including more and available and better health care, which was centered in the cities and larger towns. These and other factors contributed to the way American families related to one another, but also influenced the changes that occurred in American attitudes towards dying and death and grieving and mourning. Also, along with this, children who were once seen as vital contributors to the family's economy on the farm are now seen as unproductive members of the family, and seen to be children are those beings who are to be cared for and protected. This protective stance by parents included protection as well from pain and suffering at all costs. As a result of these changes, U.S. families have become adjusted not only to pain avoidance as a pain avoidance culture, but to a death-denying culture as well. And what happens is, as Doka is quoted as saying, adults transmit this denial, usually accompanied by assorted fears and anxieties related to death and dying, verbally and non-verbally to the children. Because young children are particularly dependent upon adults in their lives, they rely upon those adults for cues and clues about how to interpret events, Doka says. So what happens? What happens is when children's needs are neglected in this way, when they're not allowed to appropriate avenues to explore and express their grief, and are not permitted to authentically mourn the loss of a significant other or an object, be it an object or a pet or a close family member, the effect upon these children is what is termed iatrogenic. It's a medical term, meaning that it causes psychological or physiological harm to the child rather than being of benefit. We say, well, it does them more harm than good. It's certainly true whenever you speak of medicine. If a doctor gives you a medicine, for example, for help with your heart and it destroys your kidneys, so we can say that it is iatrogenic in nature, doing more harm than good. As Wolfelt explains, unacknowledged feelings express themselves as irritability, chronic anxiety, low-grade depressions, and in general, a negative outlook on life. Defensive barriers. Defensive barriers she or he learns to create put her at risk or him at risk for fallout symptoms such as depression, anxiety, difficulty with intimate relationships, addictive behaviors, and other problems. You see, it's very important that we attend to the needs of children in early age whenever the onset of the crisis exists, in order that they may not have further and long-lasting negative effects in their lives. The result of this protection of children can result in what Doka terms disenfranchised grief, or grief that is not allowed to be expressed. Wolfelt calls this, and uses the term, carried grief, or shadows of ghosts of grief. Kenneth Doka was the first to identify or to coin this term, disenfranchised grief, in 1985 in a book entitled Disenfranchised Grief, Recognizing Hidden Sorrow. And he states this: disenfranchised grief occurs when there is a loss of meaningful and significant attachment that may not be recognized or validated by others. The grief subsequently experienced is then disenfranchised. The loss cannot be openly acknowledged, socially validated, or publicly mourned. So there are circumstances, however, in which a person experiences a sense of loss, but does not have a socially recognized right or a role or a capacity to grieve. In these cases, Doka says, the grief is disenfranchised. The person suffers a loss but has little or no opportunity to mourn publicly. Let's look at some examples of this. Disenfranchised grief in children, for example, and others, is loss that is not recognized. First of all, loss that is not recognized might include a pet loss. I remember when I had a dog that died, my dad, he was 10 years old. My dad didn't think it was very important that we take him to the vet. Back in those days, back in the 60s, we didn't spend money on pets too much, but so my dad did take my dog to the vet. Little did I know that he took him there to ultimately be euthanized rather than to be healed and cured, and which is what I thought. So that loss was basically not recognized by me, and I think that's repeated in a number of cases. What about estranged family members? People that are estranged from the family. It could be a parent, could be a parent that's away because of divorce, grandparents that live in another part of the country or another part of the globe, or siblings that are estranged from the family and maybe cut off in some way. Unacknowledged grief in prenatal death, for example, stillbirth or miscarriage. Do we acknowledge those? Do we have some kind of a ritual to recognize and acknowledge that a death has occurred? What about abortion? What about suicides? It's that thing that no one likes to talk about. Maybe it's that secret in the family. A loss of a boyfriend. Maybe it's been your boyfriend or girlfriend for a couple of years in high school, and then they break up. Some parents might say, "Oh, I'm glad that's over," but the people that are involved, the child, the teenager, may experience a very deep loss over that. Losses of the very old, perhaps a mate, a sweet mate in a nursing home, for example. I know my mother, when she was experiencing latter stages of dementia, she was in a nursing home, and she had, she'd go to lunch and come back, and the bed would be empty next to her. I wonder if we do a very good job, I suspect we don't, of informing those people in the nursing homes or caring facilities what happened to their friends that they have lunch with every day. A lot of these places, they're assigned seating. So, one day they show up and the seat is empty around their dinner table. And the very young, sometimes we just don't acknowledge or talk about the death because we want to protect the very young. Not only is the loss not recognized, but sometimes the grievers are not recognized. And we'll talk about this in more detail later. Mentally disabled persons, for example, just think, well, they can't understand. Well, they comprehend a lot more than we can give them credit for. They have routines, and if somebody who's a part of that routine is gone, they will certainly grieve over that. If you're old enough or have the capacity enough to love, it is said you have the capacity enough to grieve. Young children who are protected from their grief and mourning, as we mentioned, because the grandparent lives in another part of of the country or moves out and goes to the nursing home and dies, and we don't tell the child what exactly happened. We use euphemisms. They're gone on a trip or they've gone to sleep, things like that. We need to be careful. We'll talk more about that as we go along. So take 5, I'd like for you, before you move into the next module, to do the assigned activity, and that is take the grief and loss inventory, the childhood grief and loss inventory, and spend some time with that. There are several questions there. I'm going to ask you to share with the group from your inventory your earliest memory of a loss. It could be a pet, it could be a grandparent, it could be a friend, maybe in elementary school or junior high. But think about that earliest memory of your loss, or one of your earliest memories. Were there any adults in your life who helped you through this period of grief? And talk about that, write about that. And if support was received, tell about what they did that was helpful. If support was not received, what would you have wished would have happened during that time? And then what I'd like for you to do is then let's move to a forum, and we will discuss that together. And I'd like for you to comment and to share in that forum with your classmates. I think it'll be very helpful for us as we begin this journey together. In conclusion of this first module of introduction, the course objectives or the objectives for this module were to define the course objectives, which we have done. I'd like for you to review those, understand those, understand the requirements of the Austin Graduate School of Theology Online Essentials, and go and read those and check that as completed, and then recall one's own childhood experience of grief and loss in the inventory, which you will find as one of the first activities. So I look forward to spending some time together with you, and I look forward to those inventories as you complete this activity, and to respond to not only your fellow students, your peers, but also the professors' submissions and comments as well. I'd be glad for you to comment on my thoughts as well as we review those. So thanks for joining me in this study. We will be moving through these materials at a rapid pace, so please don't get behind, especially in the reading and of the text and the reading activities that will be uploaded in PDF or Word format. The assignments which you're required to do, don't get behind in those. I look forward to our time together, a time of good learning, and from learning from you as well. So have a blessed week, and God bless.